But we're going to start tonight actually in Athens, of all places. We're going to start tonight by talking about a temple there called the Temple of Olympian Zeus. Let me actually put it on screen for a minute. Okay. So hopefully you can all see that. This is the Temple of Olympian Zeus as it looks today. It's a ruin. But in its heyday, this was actually the largest temple in all of Greece. And it was far larger than the Parthenon, that the more famous, temple that sits at the top of the Acropolis. Turns out that the history of this pagan temple will actually help us understand some elements of our own Jewish history. So here's an overview of the history of this pagan temple. Okay, the Temple of Olympian Zeus was started way back in the year 550 BCE. That's a long time ago, 550 BCE. On our Jewish time scale, that's during the Babylonian exile. Okay, after our first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, our second Beit HaMikdash was not yet built. That's around the time that the Greeks first started building this temple of Olympian Zeus. And at the time that it was first begun, it was kind of a giant ego project that was started by a family of, they were remembered as kind of tyrannical leaders of the time that ruled over Athens with an iron fist. And they got this project started, but it never really got going. And then the ruling family fell, and the site sat for hundreds of years unfinished. And it was like a big giant white elephant just sitting there unfinished. And in fact, this crazy, again, this giant unfinished project sitting in Athens became famous and kind of like a morality tale. Look at what happens when a tyrant's ego gets out of control and when they do crazy things that are detached from reality. And it's actually mentioned by Aristotle, for example. Aristotle mentions this temple in his work, The Politics, as an example of how tyrannies love mega projects because they use mega projects to keep the impoverished masses busy working endlessly on all kinds of grand projects so the people won't have time to rebel. Okay, so it sits there for hundreds of years, just as, kind of a morality tale. And then after that, things suddenly change in the year 174 BCE. Okay, so it's like 275 years after the project was started. Okay, so this is during the reign of a Seleucid Greek king named none other than Antiochus IV Epiphanes. If that name sounds familiar to you, that is Antiochus from the Chanukah story. Okay, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, Antiochus das. Antiochus had a pretty big ego himself. He considered himself to be the embodiment of Zeus on earth. And so he revived this massive project to build the Temple of Olympian Zeus as a great tribute to the god Zeus, which kind of meant to himself, since he saw himself as the embodiment of Zeus in this world. And so the same Antiochus who defiled our second Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim and introduced pagan practices there, the same guy was the same king who decided to build for himself the greatest pagan temple of his day. Okay, so I'll stop sharing. Let's think a little bit more about this. So we know from our own Jewish history that Antiochus wasn't quite as great as he made himself out to be. In fact, the Seleucid Greeks, basically the kingdom that he ruled over, were on the way down at this point. That's kind of the broader geopolitical setting of the story of Chanukah. Chanukah takes place during a period of Seleucid Greek decline. And that's part of the backdrop that kind of creates the opening for us, for the Jews, the residents of this colony or this territory of Judea, right? We basically fight off our overlords and we create under the Maccabees our own kingdom. And so this is an incredible story, right? The Hashmonaim kick out the Greeks, the Seleucid Greeks, and founded an independent Jewish kingdom in the land of Israel, something that had not existed in the Holy Land since the Babylonians destroyed the first Beit HaMikdash about 400 years before. So this is a tremendous achievement, obviously, which we celebrate every year. So, okay, so much for Antiochus, the son of Zeus, maybe not as powerful as he perhaps thought. Now, getting back to Athens, to the temple of Olympian Zeus, and to Antiochus's massive pet project, okay? He failed at that also. Turns out that Antiochus dies with the temple only like half complete. And then the project stalled again. So now it was an even bigger white elephant. It was like a giant monument to the failure of Antiochus, this giant ego project that sat unfinished for everyone to see for, again, hundreds of years. That's how the temple of Olympian Zeus sat for another 300 or so years, partially built or ruined until after 300 years, the Roman Emperor Hadrian came along. By that time, the Romans were the new dominant power. And Hadrian was Roman emperor, but he loved and looked up to Greek culture. So he decided to spruce up the once great city of Athens, which had fallen into decline. And as part of Hadrian's renovation of the city of Athens, he took on the project of completing this massive temple. And Hadrian decided that he finally would be the one to build the temple of Olympian Zeus. Now, Hadrian was not like Antiochus. Hadrian was not messing around. He was a guy who got things done, and he actually finished the project. And it was massive, and it was awesome, okay? Now, keep in mind, again, Antiochus is a very different kind of ruler than, Hadrian is a very different type of ruler than Antiochus, whereas Antiochus marks the waning days of his Seleucid Empire before they fall into decline. Hadrian's rule is near the height of the Roman Empire. So to give you a sense, the famous Hadrian's Wall in northern England, maybe some of you have been there, okay? That is basically where the Roman Empire said, you know, kind of ad con, like this is the border. This is as far as the civilized world of the Roman Empire as they saw it ends. Everything beyond this wall is the barbarian tribes to the north. But think about how far they got, all the way to the north of England. So it shows you how far the Roman Empire had expanded at that time. At this point, Rome is not just a Mediterranean power. At this point, Rome is the predominant global power. And just then, close to the peak of the Roman Empire's might, another Jewish rebellion breaks out in the land of Israel. That's the setting for the Bar Kochba revolt, which takes place in the year 132. In a very different geopolitical climate than when the Hashmonaim, for example, revolted against the declining Seleucid Greeks. The Bar Kochba revolt was a revolt against the ascendant Roman Empire, again, near the height of its power. And to keep our metaphor of this great temple of Olympian Zeus going, this was 3 years after Hadrian had just completed this giant temple, something that Antiochus had never managed to pull off in his lifetime. So maybe this history of this giant temple in Athens is actually, I think, just kind of an interesting way of framing two very different times that our people decided to rise up by force against our oppressive overlords. Once by the Maccabees against Antiochus and his Seleucid Greeks, which was incredibly successful, so successful that we celebrate the holiday of Chanukah every year, as we will this month. And the other time when we, under Bar Kochba, rise up against the Roman Empire for the second time after the kind of initial destruction in 70, but this kind of second great revolt against Rome during the Bar Kochba times, which turned out to be an awful and tragic failure, which we don't talk about quite as much. Okay, the Hasmonean dynasty of the Hashmonaim after Chanukah, that dynasty lasts around 100 years or so, depending on exactly how you count the beginning and exactly how you count the end. So let's say around 100 years, but who's counting, okay? And the Hashmonaim kingdom, again, kind of first emerges with the Chanukah story at a time when the Greeks are in decline and Rome has not yet taken over yet. But once the Romans came in and swallowed up Judea into the Roman Empire, we lost our sovereignty. Even when the Beit HaMikdash continued to stand, and certainly after it was destroyed, at that point, the Romans are kind of in charge. And so Bar Kochba's revolt was against Roman power, again, just during a very different geopolitical reality than the Hashmonaim ever faced. Ultimately, Bar Kochba and his rebels managed to carve out a small area of an independent Jewish statelet, or right, independent Jewish rule that lasted about 2.5 years before it was crushed by the Romans. So, with that background, in this month of Kislev, where we celebrate the victories of the Maccabees, right, and Chanukah, it's also, I think, just worth it to think a little bit about the Bar Kochba rebellion, because both are part of our history. These are the last two times prior to the founding of the State of Israel that Jews won independence by force in the Holy Land. Obviously, it was quite short under Bar Kochba, just 2.5 years versus 100 under the Hashmonaim. Okay, so one time it worked out great, one time not so much. Tonight we're going to think about the Bar Kochba revolt and just some things that we might take away from it. Okay, so part of the reason that we don't talk as much about the Bar Kochba rebellion, in addition to the fact that it didn't go so well for us, but in addition to that, one reason that we don't talk quite as much about it is that we don't know as much about it. The outside historical sources about Bar Kochba are scarce compared to the information that we have when it comes to the Hashmonaim rebellion, or even the rebellion under in the year 70 that led to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. So in the year 70, for example, the kind of first Jewish revolt against Rome, we have Josephus. Josephus, the famous Jewish historian, writing for a Roman audience, who tells the story of what happened there. There's no one like that during the Bar Kochba period that we can kind of open his book and see at least what a historian of the time would have said. We don't have anything like the book of Maccabees. So when it comes to the story of the Hashmonaim, we don't have a biblical book, right? We don't have anything that is similar to like what the Megillah does for us for Purim, that tells us the story in Tanakh itself. But there are these books, the books of Maccabees, which are old books, not quite exactly from the exact date of the Maccabees themselves, but within not too long thereafter, there are Jewish people writing to say, here's the history of the Hashmonaim, and they tell us what, in their understanding, happened in the Chanukah story and in the Maccabee revolt against Rome, or sorry, against the Greeks. So we have nothing like that when it comes to Bar Kochba. No Josephus, no book of Maccabees, nothing like that. We do have some things if you're looking for kind of external sources, non-Jewish sources. There's a Roman senator named Cassius Dio, and he's writing decades later, but he does mention the Bar Kochba revolt in his history of Rome. He has a general history of Rome, and this kind of gets a bit of a mention. And there's some writings in some of the early church fathers that talk about Bar Kochba. But the bottom line is that in external sources, we don't have great things to look at. And even in the Jewish sources, in the classical Jewish sources, the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Midrashim, they don't shed a ton of light on exactly what happened. There are sources, and we will go through them, but they don't give us all that much clarity. Now, there is some archaeological evidence from the days of the revolt, which gives us some context. And it's interesting that people in the land of Israel had long been aware that, for example, there were coins that they had from this period. So it's interesting that Bar Kochba coins are actually mentioned in the Yerushalmi, in the Gemara, in the Yerushalmi, actually in Masechet Maser Sheni. Okay, so there's an interesting discussion there where it discusses which types of coinage are still good tender. Which types of coins can you use, basically? Okay, because it's in the context of Maser Sheni. What can you use to sell goods and then take them to Yerushalayim, etc. Okay, so in that discussion, Rabbi Chia says, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, he says that matbea shemarad kegon ben koziva eno mechalel, which means a revolutionary coin like the coins of Bar Koziva are not to be exchanged. So the Gemara Yerushalmi is talking about these Bar Kochba coins. By the time of, again, this was said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, so by the time of the early mid 200s CE, so 100 years-ish after Bar Kochba, these coins that were minted by the rebels are mentioned as not being valuable coinage. And let me just for kicks, let's just put that on screen just to show, if you haven't seen, what these look like. It's kind of neat. So these are coins from the Bar Kochba period. These coins were actually minted by recycling old Roman coins. So what they would do is they would take Roman coins, they would heat them up, and then they would press new designs on top. Sometimes you could even see some traces of the original coin left from an imperfect press. It's basically a cheap way to make a new coin. You start with an old one, you change the design. And the coin on the left, this is understood to be a picture of the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, that's what this is meant to represent. Keep in mind, the Beit HaMikdash had been destroyed over 60 years before the days of Bar Kochba, but in their coinage, they're still kind of pointing to the Beit HaMikdash as the goal, perhaps. Maybe that's the message, is that the hope is to restore the Beit HaMikdash again. The right side, this is obvious, this is a lulav and etrog. This is the etrog, this is a lulav, and this is meant to be a lulav and etrog. And if you notice this writing, you look at that and you say, what in the world is that? If you didn't know, that is what the Gemara calls Ktav Ivri, which you might call, the academics would call Paleo-Hebrew script, which is, so again, the Gemara talks about this, or the Talmud talks about this, that before the Babylonian exile, we used to use a different, it was the same alphabet Gimel, but different letters to represent each letter of the alphabet, and this is what it looked like. So, and then it is only after we came back from Bavel that we started using the script that we use today, what we think of as Hebrew script. So it's funny that what's called Ktav Ivri, Hebrew script, actually means this in the Gemara, and Ktav Ashuri, Assyrian script, means what we call Hebrew. Okay. So anyways, why did they do that? It seems that what Bar Kochba and his rebels wanted was a restoration of the way things were, a rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, a restoration, may be represented by this using of the old Hebrew, of like kind of going back, Chadesh Yameinu Kakedem, maybe could have been, a phrase that would have summed up what they were trying to achieve. Okay. And it's interesting, the coins, also, if you look at what the coins say, it gives you a sense of what the rebels were about. So the coins will say things on them like, for the freedom of Jerusalem. Or some say year 1 of the redemption of Israel, or year 2 of the redemption of Israel. There is no year 3 because the rebels the revolt was crushed before they ever minted year 3. But anyways, year 1 or 2 of the redemption of Israel for the freedom of Jerusalem. These are what their coins say. The leader of the revolt was named Shimon Bar Kochba, also known as Bar Kochba. Bar Kochba from Kochav, star. So Bar Kochba, the son of the star, though his actual given name would have been Bar Kochba, Shimon Bar Kochba. His full name does not appear on any of the coins, but some of the coins do refer to Shimon Hanasi. So maybe that was a title that he took on. Okay, so for a long time, that's about all we knew about Bar Kochba from the archaeological record. Some coins found here and there until the 1950s, when Yigal Yadin, and if that name sounds familiar, Yigal Yadin, an Israeli general, but also an archaeologist, right? And he is the same man who excavated Masada. So the same guy, Yigal Yadin, who excavates Masada, is also searching around caves in the mountains near En Gedi, and his expedition found something amazing. They found packages of letters dating back to the time of the Bar Kochba revolt. And these letters puts a more personal light on the whole story. Okay, so these are like these packages of writings that they find in these caves, near the Qumran caves, near En Gedi, like in that kind of Judean deserty area. Okay, and when you read those letters, they start to give a much more personal feel to what's going on, much more than a coin can ever get across, right? Because this is truly in the voice of the rebels, or maybe in the voice of Bar Kochba himself. They're written in Aramaic, which would have been their language, right? The kind of lingua franca at the time. And so here's an example. I'll just read you a translation. This is a letter that they found. It says, Shimon to Yehuda bar Menashe to Kiryat. Kiryat Aravia. So that, okay, so it's basically talking about Shimon. Is that Bar Kochba? Perhaps sending to the certain person in a certain place. It says, I have sent you 2 donkeys that you shall send with them 2 men, and it names these men, okay, in order that they shall pack and send to the camp toward you lulavim and etrogim. Okay, so I am sending you lulavs and etrogs, and you from your place send the others who will bring the hadassin and the aravim. So basically, we saw already that the lulav and etrog were on the coins. This is talking about how during the war, it seems they want to make sure that they have lulav and etrog and hadas and arava. They have all the pieces to do the arba minim. And then interestingly, it says, and make sure that they are set in order, which is interpreted apparently to mean make sure that tithes were taken, that maser was taken, okay, perhaps. Make sure they're set in order and send them to the camp. Okay, and then it ends, oh, this is actually interesting. So send them to the camp since the army is big. And then it says, be well. And that's the end of that letter. Okay, so that, like, again, like very personal touch. Here's another letter. It goes like this. Shimon bar Kochba to Yehonatan and to Masabala. Okay, and then it says, let all men from Tekoa who are with you be sent to me without delay. So basically, Bar Kochba, it seems, needs more troops wherever he is. He's like, send me people right away. I need reinforcements. And then the letter goes on. It says, if you do not send them, let it be known to you that you will be punished. So it gives you a little bit of feel that maybe there was already some breaking in the ranks at this time. Maybe the war's not going so great. He's basically saying, send me reinforcements and don't think about not sending them or I'll get you. Okay, and in some of the even later letters, I won't read them all, but you get even greater sense of the desperation of Bar Kochba just trying to hold the whole thing together. Okay, ultimately we know it did not end well. Some of the best Roman legions were sent to put down the rebellion and to make an example of what happens when you revolt against Rome. Okay, so that's what we know from, let's just say, archaeology. So what do our traditional Jewish sources have to say about the revolt? The answer is less than you'd expect. For something of this level of importance, we have fewer kind of mentions of it than you would have expected, I think. The Bar Kochba rebellion took place around 70-ish years, 60 plus years before the writing of the Mishnah, actually. Yeah, so about the Mishnah is around 200. We're talking the 130s. Okay, so that's that's a long time, but not a long time, right? 60, 70 years before the writing of the Mishnah, let alone like the original sources of the Mishnah. But Bar Kochba or Bar Kochba or however you want to refer to it is not mentioned by name anywhere in the Mishnah. The revolt is mentioned only tangentially in the Mishnah. So for example, the Mishnah in Ta'anit lists 5 calamities that took place on Tisha B'Av, explaining why this is the saddest day of the Jewish calendar. And one of those 5 calamities listed is the capture of the town of Beitar. And Beitar was the last stronghold of the Bar Kochba rebels, who felt, obviously they fall to the Romans. This is one of the 5 sad reasons why Tisha B'Av is the saddest day of our calendar. So it is mentioned, but just a little tangentially, like the fall of Beitar. And then in the Mishnah in Sota, it mentions that in the, quote, last war, which presumably means the Bar Kochba war, certain restrictions were placed on the way that weddings were celebrated. Basically, it was maybe so sad. The last war was so awful that, the way that we celebrated weddings changed. Okay, so there's a mention of this, perhaps. It's true that the Mishnah tends to deal more with halacha than with history. So it's not entirely shocking that we don't hear more about the revolt, but even so, anyways, that is the case. The Mishnah does not tell us much about the Bar Kochba revolt. As we start to move into later sources, in the Gemara and some Midrashim, we'll start to pick up a few mentions. It's interesting that these sources include a range of views about the Bar Kochba revolt. Some the reflections are more positive. In some, the reflections on the revolt are more negative. Some are more ambivalent. On the whole, it seems clear that Chazal looked back on the episode of Bar Kochba as having been a mistake. But anyways, let's go through some of these sources quickly, just so that we kind of all have them in our mind. So first, the positive sources in our tradition, the positive sources about the Bar Kochba revolt. So the most famous is Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva himself declared Bar Kochba to have been the Mashiach. This statement by Rabbi Akiva is actually cited in a number of places, including the Yerushalmi and Ta'anit. Rabbi Akiva points to Bar Kochba as the fulfillment of the messianic prophecy that a star, a kochav, will come forth from Yaakov. Okay, that's actually a line from Bilam's prophecies. So that's from that line from Bilam that says, Darach kochav miYaakov v'kam shivto miYisrael, or v'kam shevet miYisrael, that a star will come up from Yaakov. So Rabbi Akiva interpreted that to mean that, quote, it says, when Rabbi Akiva saw Bar Kochba, he said, this one is the Melech HaMashiach. Okay, that's from the Yerushalmi and Ta'anit. Eicha Rabbah, for example, seems to proudly describe Bar Kochba as having been a mighty warrior. So in this, in this midrash on Eicha, it says, this is a quote, it says, and what was the strength of Bar Kochba? They said that when he went to war, he would catch missiles, kind of incoming missiles, let's say, thrown from a catapult on one of his legs and hurl them back, killing several men. Very mighty warrior, tells us according to the midrash. We're told that Bar Kochba had a great army, and we're told that he made his recruits cut off a finger, or maybe part of a finger, to prove their bravery. I guess that's, actually we're told that that was going too far, according to the rabbis. So very brave, maybe taking it a little bit too far. And the Gemara also tells us in multiple places, in Bava Kama and Brachot, also in the Yerushalmi and Brachot, and Tani, a bunch of different places, about a miracle that happened to the bodies of the people who died at Beitar, at the hand of the Romans. These are the final holdouts in the final days of the Bar Kochba revolt. The Gemara says that their bodies did not decompose, and that even though the bodies were left unburied, while the Romans butchered everyone there, the Gemara tells us that this great miracle of the bodies not decomposing is the source of our fourth bracha and benching, Hatov V'Ametiv. So the fourth bracha of benching, we are told, is to commemorate the miracle of the bodies of Beitar that did not decompose. So these are kind of all, let's just say, more positive takes on Bar Kochba and his men. But there are other sources that have a more negative view of Bar Kochba. So for example, the Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us, it says as follows, he says, Bar Kochba reigned for 2.5 years. He said to the rabbis, I am the Mashiach. This is a little bit of a different spin. And according to the Gemara in Sanhedrin, the rabbis saw that he was not worthy. And then he was killed. Actually, it's not totally clear as you read that Gemara whether the Gemara is implying that the rabbis killed him or that he just was killed by the Romans. But in any case, that Gemara is not sad to see him go. Okay? And, okay. And there are hints in other sources that maybe Bar Kochba wasn't so righteous after all. We're told in the Midrash on Eicha. This is all in the Midrash on Eicha because Eicha is the saddest book. So the Midrash on Eicha, in discussing the sadness, some of it winds up discussing Bar Kochba. So that Midrash says that Bar Kochba would say a strange prayer when he went to battle, which went as follows. He said, "O Hashem, please don't help us, and please don't hinder us." Like saying, don't worry, Hashem, I've got this. Implying that maybe he did not have the right state of mind, the humility before God that he should have had going into battle. He was like, don't worry, God, don't help us, don't hurt us, I've got this. And the Midrash in Eicha goes further and says, it says that Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan says that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, used to interpret that line from Bilam, Darach Kochav miYaakov. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi apparently used to interpret that line very differently to the way that Rabbi Akiva did. Rabbi Akiva had used that line to be to name Bar Kochba, the star of Yaakov. Apparently, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, living many years after the failure of the Bar Kochba revolt, he interpreted, he said, Al tikri kochav ela kozav. Don't interpret that as a star, rather interpret it as a liar, meaning implying that Bar Kochba was a lying charlatan or a false messiah. Okay? And a number of sources also quote a certain wisecrack response of Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta in response to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says that Bar Kochba was Mashiach, and there are a number of sources that quote the following quote from Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta. He apparently replied, Akiva, the grass will have grown from between your jaws, and still the son of David will not have come. Meaning, Rabbi Akiva, you will be long dead before the coming of Mashiach. Of course, basically, Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta wasn't buying. Okay. Interestingly, when you look many years later, Rambam's formulation, because Rambam talks about the Bar Kochba revolt, and he seems to take a little bit of a middle ground, you could say. So Rambam describes Bar Kochba not so much as a false Messiah, but as a failed Messiah. So that is to say, as someone who was potentially believable as the Mashiach. Not that he was like a lying, empty charlatan, okay, but that he was someone who had the potential to be Mashiach. But then when it became clear that he failed in reality when he was killed, then it became clear that he must not have been Mashiach after all. And so the Rambam, this is in Hilchot Melachim in the 11th chapter, this is how Rambam puts it. This is a quote. He says, Rabbi Akiva was one of the great sages of the Mishnah, and he was a great supporter of Ben Kochba, the king. And he declared him to be the Melech HaMashiach. And all of the sages of his generation shared this belief. This is Rambam's understanding of it, that Bar Kochba was the Melech HaMashiach until he was killed in his iniquity, so something went wrong. In his sins, he died, and it became known to them that he was not in fact the Mashiach. Okay, so Rambam's explanation brings up this kind of interesting point that sometimes this is Rambam pointing out, that sometimes even wise and righteous sages can choose the wrong path when it comes to, let's say, politics or choosing who the Mashiach is, whatever it is. Even the sages and even Rabbi Akiva can get that wrong. Case in point, right? This is the proof that they were all in. At least Rabbi Akiva, and Rambam seems to imply the kind of the Chachamim in general, were all in on Bar Kochba, all in on the idea that rising up against Rome was a good time. Maybe that Bar Kochba himself was the man to lead the charge as the Mashiach. And maybe sometimes when you're in the middle of it, it's hard to know what the case is. You don't find out until the end, right? That's what Rambam says. In the end, when he died, it became clear that he was not the Mashiach. I guess that's just how life is sometimes, that you have to wait until you see the consequences of your decisions. And then in the end, in retrospect, you can figure out whether you or even the Chachamim got things right or got things wrong. Okay, so that's an interesting interpretation from Rambam. Okay, so this is the great tension of the Bar Kochba story. The great tension of the Bar Kochba story is that the army, as we've seen, was made up of religiously driven people longing to restore the Beit HaMikdash, full of messianic fervor, with support from some of the great rabbis of their day. Nevertheless, this revolt fails miserably in its attempt to kick out the Romans. So that's the tension. It seems like it has so much potential and has so much backing, and yet it fails miserably. And that's a hard story for us to wrap our head around. Maybe that is why the Mishnah doesn't talk as much about the Bar Kochba story, why the Gemara has mixed views on it. Basically, at the peak of Roman power, near the peak of Roman power, under their Emperor Hadrian, something broke the camel's back. Something pushed at least some Jews living in the land of Israel over the edge. It's not totally clear what that was. It may have been that Hadrian imposed new religious persecutions outlawing Brit Milah, for example. It may have been the Hadrians started building on the Temple Mount and started building a pagan city in Yerushalayim. That may be the cause. It may be that this was 70 years. I know my dad likes to point out it, 70 years after, roughly, coming up on 70 years after the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, and perhaps people had in their minds Yirmiyahu's prophecy from the first destruction, that after 70 years the people would return. Maybe people, as you approach the 70-year mark after the first destruction, were just having a messianic fervor in the air. So maybe for any and all of these reasons, there was good reason to rebel. And that's what Bar Kochba and his supporters did. They said, we can do this. We can beat these guys. We can kick the Romans out. As the coins say, for the freedom of Jerusalem, for the redemption of Israel. If Hashem is behind us, you can imagine them saying, who can stop us? And even the great Rabbi Akiva thought that Bar Kochba, was the man to lead the charge, maybe that he was even the Mashiach. But as it turned out, Bar Kochba's followers, it seems, were wrong. The revolt was a resounding failure. It had some short-term victories, but the long-run results were actually awful. And in truth, the Jewish community of the land of Israel in some ways never recovers. So, with all that kind of as the historical backdrop, it is interesting that Bar Kochba coins were featured on some of the earliest stamps of the state of Israel. So when you kind of fast forward now to our times, again, the Bar Kochba coins are featured on some of the earliest stamps of the modern state of Israel. And this is similar in some respects to the way that the early Zionists embraced Masada as a story that kind of called out to them. It's a similar story. It's a heroic story of unyielding Jewish resistance, even if both of those stories actually don't turn out that well. But it gives you a sense of the mindset of that sometimes you just have to stand up and fight, even if the odds are impossibly stacked against you, no matter what the repercussions. Sometimes you have to just stand up against everyone. That seems to be in the mindset of embracing Bar Kochba and Masada as kind of stories that don't have a lot of currency in our religious texts over the last couple thousand years. To be honest, those are not major stories that we talk about much. But in the modern story of the modern state, they become more important stories. Bar Kochba, Masada, etc. Though, again, you can't help but recognize that those stories don't turn out particularly well for us. And anyways, all this is to say, and maybe I'll kind of wrap up by taking it all the way to modern day, that I started looking into this, spending more time thinking about this, again, just because on the one hand, it's the month of Kislev, and we talk so much about our victories under the Maccabees, and it just seems like a time when it's worth thinking more broadly about our attempts to throw off those who have oppressed us. And I can't help but saying that in this year we're again in this kind of fog of war in the modern day, when our leaders in Israel have to make all kinds of hard decisions about what we have to stand and fight for, and when to put life and death trade-offs, which to make, what are our red lines, what are the things that are just too much to take, what are the things where it makes sense to go down with the ship, what are the things where it makes sense to attack, and when to hold back. Okay, these are just very, very hard decisions, and they're difficult. They're difficult decisions that our leaders are going through today, again, in the fog of war. And I think, hopefully, at least to me, what thinking about the Bar Kochba story relative to the Maccabee story, what it means to me to some extent is just that we have to recognize that these are difficult decisions, meaning that there are people who don't think these are hard decisions. There are people who are, just always doves who think there's always one answer to questions of what to do. And there are some people who are always hawks and think that there's always another answer of what to do. For some people, it seems that they're, just kind of pre-wired ideologically, perhaps, to follow a certain path. Okay. as the saying goes, if you're a hammer, all you see is nails. So for some people, these decisions about what to do seem easy. But in reality, the decisions that our leaders make in times of war are hard because they're not obvious. And the choices that they make matter. They matter for all of us in the big picture, and they matter for the individual soldiers obviously being sent to the front. And I don't envy the people who have to make these very hard choices. And again, the fact that there is a story of the Maccabees and there is a story of Bar Kochba is just another example of the fact that making good decisions means realizing that every situation is different, that you have to make sure not to fall into the trap of always fighting the last war, that the right decision for today might not be the right decision for tomorrow. And it's interesting that the Mishnah, again, as I mentioned, written 60 some years after the Bar Kochba disaster, barely talks about Chanukah. Sorry, this is a little different. The Mishnah barely talks about Chanukah. That's something we talked about in a previous shiur. It talks very little about Bar Kochba, but it doesn't. The Mishnah barely talks about Chanukah, which is interesting. Maybe so soon after a great destruction, maybe it was a little too early to talk in the same way about even our victories. And then if you go to today, we barely ever talk about Bar Kochba. Maybe even talking about not winning today feels weird in a time when we are used to only thinking about Jewish armies winning on the battlefield. Anyways, bottom line is that Kislev just feels like a time to think about this set of issues, because Kislev is the month where we focus for the most part, and this is the right way to think about it. This is the month of focusing on our victories. Ala nisim, v'ala purkan, v'ala gvorot, v'ala tshuot, v'ala milchamot, right? Shasita lavotenu, etc. Right? We focus on our amazing victories and redemption, on the victory of the Maccabees, who fought off Antiochus and his Seleucid Greeks and won. When the few defeated the many, and that's what we celebrate every year. An incredible, unlikely story, and that is our story, right? That's the main story. But maybe it's also worth at least kind of having in the back of our mind that victory isn't the only Jewish story, as we know, and that victory is not assured even when you're fighting in God's name. That's the hard aspect of the story of Bar Kochba. It's a very hard lesson to even wrap your head around, but it seems like they had so much going for them, clearly with some faults, but it was a religiously motivated group trying to do something to restore things as it was against an oppressive enemy, and yet they go down. So it's kind of a strange thing. Bottom line is we have to make good choices with our heads, not only with our hearts, in situations of uncertainty based on the reality of our times. And there's no single playbook, and the situations can be different. Revolting against Antiochus is very different than revolting against Hadrian. And there's a certain kind of like gravity to our decisions because there's a lot riding on it. Okay, so this year, where we continue to be in a fog of war, hopefully our leaders will make hard choices, keeping two things in mind. First of all, the message of Chanukah, that we should never sell ourselves short, that we have to have enough vision and enough faith to know that we should never underestimate what the Jewish people are capable of with God's help, because we are, after all, the children of the Maccabees, right? We've overcome seemingly impossible odds before, and that's part of our DNA. But also important, I think, is to keep in mind that we should not imagine ourselves invincible, as if victory is somehow due to us every time we take the battlefield, as if we're somehow entitled to us. And that, of course, we have to have faith. But faith alone is not a strategy, okay? And so anyways, hopefully this resonates with folks. We are the children of the victorious Maccabees, but we also bear the painful legacy of Bar Kochba. So we celebrate Chanukah every year. We actually don't talk about Bar Kochba that much, but maybe every once in a while we should, because the Bar Kochba story just calls into focus what the stakes are when our leaders make hard choices about we, as a small people in the world, should handle ourselves. And from these two very different outcomes in Jewish history, it seems that part of the takeaway is that timing and strategy matter, that emunah might be a a necessary condition for success, but not sufficient. And so anyways, I'll leave off with that. In this month of Kislev, let's celebrate Jewish victory as we do every year, but also with a recognition that we have to make good choices in situations of uncertainty. And anyone who's ever played sports knows that sometimes you learn as much from your losses as you do from your wins. If you want your team to succeed, you have to study the game tape from both types of games. So that's what I tried to do a little bit tonight. And thanks everyone for joining.